The Galactic University of Advanced Sciences was the kind of place where you could get a PhD in 17 different ways to accidentally blow up a star, but somehow couldn't figure out how to make the coffee machines work properly. Located on the neutral station of Kepler's Folly, it attracted the most brilliant minds from across the galaxy, which, as it turned out, was both a blessing and a curse that the maintenance staff dealt with on a daily basis. Professor Vexlar swept through the xenobotany department like he owned the place, which technically he didn't, but his ego hadn't gotten that memo. Standing 7 feet tall with the kind of crystalline features that screamed, "I'm too sophisticated for your primitive understanding," he clutched a containment unit that was making some very concerning noises. "Behold," he announced to anyone within earshot, which unfortunately included the entire research wing, "the crown jewel of my expedition to Mortis Prime. A genuine Snapicus maximus, the apex predator of botanical evolution." The containment unit gave what could only be described as a hungry growl. Dr. Kellyan, the department head, peered nervously at the unit. "Vexlar, please tell me you didn't bring another one of your quote-unquote harmless specimens into my facility. The last time you said something was docile, it tried to digest Henderson's entire desk." "This is completely different," Vexlar huffed, his crystalline features shifting to a defensive purple. "The Snapicus maximus is a sophisticated organism with complex behavioral patterns. It merely requires proper environmental conditions and respect for its natural hunting instincts." Which was academic speak for "it eats things and I have no idea how to stop it." The maintenance staff had already started calling it Chompy because apparently giving terrifying alien death plants cute nicknames was how humans coped with impending doom. Within 6 hours of Chompy's arrival, 3 research assistants had barricaded themselves in the supply closet. The automated cleaning bots had gone into emergency shutdown, and someone had posted a sign on the xenobotany lab that read, "Danger, plant bites back." Enter Jake Morrison, the newest addition to the maintenance crew, who had the dubious honor of being assigned to the Special Projects cleaning rotation. Jake was the kind of guy who looked at a malfunctioning quantum flux capacitor and wondered if it just needed a good whack with a wrench. He approached problems with the casual confidence of someone who had grown up thinking duct tape could fix anything, including the fundamental forces of the universe. He strolled into the xenobotany lab on his second day, pushing his maintenance cart and humming something that sounded suspiciously like an ancient Earth song about not worrying. The sight that greeted him would have sent most sentient beings screaming into the void, a massive vine-covered plant with what appeared to be several sets of very sharp teeth, currently in the process of devouring a hapless lab stool. Jake stopped his cart, tilted his head, and said, "Well, aren't you a grumpy little fella?" The plant, which Jake immediately decided looked more like an oversized Venus flytrap that had been hitting the gym and taking anger management classes from a honey badger, paused mid-chew. Several alien grad students who had been cowering behind an overturned desk made frantic shushing motions at Jake, apparently under the impression that whispering, "Don't move" really loudly was somehow helpful. Jake ignored them and took a step closer. Chompy's various mouth-like appendages swiveled toward him with the kind of predatory focus usually reserved for nature documentaries and tax auditors. The plant's main body was easily 6 feet across, covered in what looked like bark but moved like muscle, and decorated with enough teeth to make a shark feel inadequate. "Yeah, I see you there, buddy," Jake said conversationally, pulling on his work gloves. "You know, you remind me of my neighbor's dog back on Earth. Mean as a rattlesnake, but mostly just needed someone to understand what it wanted." Professor Vexlar materialized from behind a supposedly blast-proof barrier, his crystalline features cycling through several shades of panic. "Morrison, step away from the specimen immediately. The Snapicus maximus has consumed 3 probe droids and a very expensive spectral analyzer since its arrival." "Has anyone tried asking it what it wants?" Jake asked, still studying Chompy with the casual interest of someone examining a mildly interesting houseplant at the garden center. "It wants to consume organic matter, obviously," Vexlar spluttered. "It's an apex predator designed by evolution to—" "Nah," Jake interrupted, watching as Chompy's main stalk swayed slightly. "Look at the way it's moving. See how it keeps turning toward the air vents? And those little twitchy motions with the smaller tendrils? This thing's hunting. Problem is, there's nothing here for it to hunt, except furniture and fancy equipment." The assembled academics exchanged the kind of looks usually reserved for watching someone try to pet a live grenade. Jake crouched down near his cart and rummaged through his supplies until he found what he was looking for, an empty coffee container that had seen better decades. "Tell you what, Chompy, let's see if we can find you some proper food." 20 minutes later, Jake returned from the cafeteria with his coffee container buzzing ominously. The cafeteria's perpetual fly problem, a result of serving food that most species couldn't identify but were too polite to refuse, had just become the solution to the xenobotany department's carnivorous plant crisis. "Okay, big guy," Jake said, approaching Chompy with the confidence of someone who had clearly never read a safety manual in his life. "Fresh flies, caught this morning. Well, 5 minutes ago. But who's counting?" He opened the container and released a small cloud of very confused insects into the air near Chompy. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Every single one of Chompy's appendages snapped to attention like a cat spotting a laser pointer, and the plant began what could only be described as enthusiastic hunting. Professor Vexlar watched in stunned silence as his terrifying specimen transformed from rampaging monster into something that looked almost playful. "Impossible," he whispered. "The behavioral literature clearly states that Snapicus maximus exhibits only aggressive territorial responses to foreign stimuli." Jake shrugged, watching Chompy successfully snag a particularly slow fly with obvious satisfaction. "Maybe your literature never met anyone dumb enough to just ask the plant what it wanted for lunch." What started as a one-time feeding experiment quickly became Jake's favorite part of his daily routine. Every morning, at precisely 9:15, right after the first wave of caffeine-dependent researchers had shuffled past, Jake would show up at the xenobotany lab with his trusty fly container and what could only be described as the galaxy's most unorthodox feeding schedule. "Morning, Chompy," he'd say, setting down his supplies while the plant's various sensory tendrils perked up like a dog hearing the word walkies. "How we doing today? Still terrorizing the postdocs, I see?" The transformation was remarkable. Within a week, Chompy had gone from randomly attacking anything that moved to what appeared to be genuine excitement whenever Jake entered the room. The plant's aggressive snapping had been replaced by an almost rhythmic swaying motion that the research team was hesitant to call happy but couldn't really describe as anything else. "The specimen is exhibiting unprecedented behavioral modifications," Professor Vexlar dictated to his recorder, watching from behind his blast shield as Jake casually hand-fed flies to a creature that had previously tried to eat a forklift. "Subject appears to have developed recognition patterns for human maintenance personnel, Morrison, displaying what can only be categorized as anticipatory responses," which was science speak for "the murder plant has started wagging its tail." Jake, meanwhile, had begun treating Chompy like the world's most dangerous houseplant. He'd chat about his day while portioning out flies, occasionally reaching out to gently brush dirt off the plant's lower leaves, completely ignoring the way Chompy's smaller mouth edifices would snap playfully near his fingers without actually biting. "So there I was," Jake would say, releasing a particularly energetic batch of flies, trying to explain to the quantum physics department why their particle accelerator was making that weird humming noise, and Professor Zilkth starts going on about dimensional resonance frequencies. I told him, "Look, buddy, sometimes a loose bolt is just a loose bolt, you know?" Chompy would sway slightly, as if nodding along to the story, while methodically hunting down each fly with the focused determination of someone solving a particularly satisfying puzzle. The other staff members had initially thought Jake was suffering from some kind of break from reality. Dr. Myron, the head of safety protocols, had actually submitted a formal request for psychological evaluation after catching Jake explaining Earth's seasons to a plant that could theoretically digest a small spacecraft. "It's therapeutic," Jake explained, when confronted about his increasingly elaborate conversations with Chompy. "Back home, people talk to their plants all the time. Supposed to help them grow better, though usually our plants don't talk back." "Talk back?" Dr. Myron's tentacles twitched nervously. "The specimen is exhibiting vocal responses?" "Well, not talking exactly," Jake clarified, scratching his head. "More like purring, sort of a deep rumbling sound when it's content, haven't you noticed?" They hadn't, mostly because everyone else was too busy maintaining a respectful distance of at least 20 feet and several blast barriers. But Jake was right. When Chompy was well-fed and content, it did produce a low, almost musical vibration that resonated through the lab's metal flooring. Professor Vexlar had initially dismissed this as digestive processes, but the sound only occurred during Jake's visits, and seemed to correlate with what he was increasingly forced to admit was affectionate behavior. "The human has somehow established a symbiotic relationship with a Class 5 predatory organism," Vexlar muttered, watching Jake gently prune some of Chompy's outer leaves while the plant practically leaned into the attention. "This violates approximately 17 established principles of xenobiological interaction theory." Jake glanced over at the professor's recording device. "You know, Vex, maybe your theories just never accounted for someone actually being nice to the thing. Ever think of that?" The professor's crystalline features shifted to a deep shade of academic embarrassment, which looked remarkably similar to purple. The memo arrived on a Tuesday, because apparently the universe had decided that Tuesdays were the official day for ruining everyone's week. Jake found it slipped under his maintenance locker door, printed on the kind of official university letterhead that meant someone important had made a decision that would inevitably make his life more complicated. Immediate disposal notice. Xenobiological specimen XB47, Snapicus maximus, poses unacceptable risk to facility operations and personnel safety. Removal, scheduled for 800 hours, Thursday. All department personnel are advised to maintain safe distance during extraction procedures. Jake read it twice, then walked over to the xenobotany lab where Chompy was peacefully digesting his morning flies, producing that low, contented rumble that had become as much a part of Jake's routine as his first cup of coffee. "Hey there, buddy," Jake said quietly, and Chompy's sensory tendrils immediately perked up in greeting. "Looks like we might have a problem." Professor Vexlar was already in the lab, pacing back and forth with the frantic energy of someone whose entire career was about to be fed into a disposal unit along with his research specimen. His usually pristine lab coat was wrinkled, and his crystalline features kept shifting between academic panic yellow and bureaucratic defeat gray. "Morrison," he said without looking up from his frantically scribbled notes, "I don't suppose you have any experience with university administrative appeals processes." "Can't say that I do," Jake replied, reading the memo again. "Says here the decision came from the Board of Interspecies Safety. That's pretty high up the food chain." "Director Korthmak received 17 formal complaints this week alone," Vexlar explained, his voice taking on the hollow tone of someone explaining their own professional execution. "Apparently, Chompy's presence has been deemed psychologically destabilizing to the research environment." Jake glanced around the lab, which admittedly looked like a war zone. Scorch marks decorated the walls from the first few days, several pieces of expensive equipment bore distinctive bite marks, and there was still a Chompy-shaped hole in the reinforced observation window that no one had figured out how to repair. "To be fair," Jake said diplomatically, "the place does look like it got hit by a very hungry tornado." But even as he said it, Jake's attention was drawn to Chompy, who had apparently been listening to their conversation. The plant's main body had drooped slightly, and its usually active hunting appendages hung limp. For a creature that didn't technically have facial expressions, Chompy was doing a remarkably good impression of looking sad. "It understands," Jake realized with a start. "Vex, I think it knows what's happening." Professor Vexler looked up from his notes, following Jake's gaze to where Chompy sat motionless except for the occasional dejected rustle of leaves. "Impossible. While Snapicus maximus does exhibit above-average intelligence for a plant-based organism, emotional comprehension requires—" He was interrupted by a sound that made everyone in the lab freeze. It was low and mournful, like a whale song played through a broken speaker, emanating from somewhere deep within Chompy's root system. The plant's bioluminescent patches, which usually glowed a healthy green during feeding time, had dimmed to an almost sickly yellow. "Oh no," Jake said, the full weight of the situation hitting him. "It's not just upset, it's scared." The next morning brought the removal team, 6 heavily armed security personnel, 3 containment specialists, and enough firepower to level a small asteroid. They arrived with the kind of military precision that suggested they'd done this sort of thing before, and weren't planning on taking any chances with university health insurance claims. Chompy's reaction to the invasion was immediate and dramatic. The plant that had been docilely accepting head pats just the day before suddenly erupted into full defensive mode, its appendages thrashing wildly as it attempted to create a barrier between itself and the approaching team. The mournful wailing sound grew louder and more desperate, echoing through the ventilation system until it seemed like the entire building was crying. "Tranquilizer darts aren't penetrating the outer bark layer," reported Team Leader Voss, a no-nonsense security chief who looked like she could intimidate a black hole into behaving. "Switching to containment foam." "Wait!" Jake called out, but his voice was lost in the chaos as Chompy went into full panic mode, destroying equipment and generally making the case for its own disposal with every terrified thrash of its massive form. Jake did what any reasonable human would do when faced with an impossible situation involving bureaucracy, weaponized security teams, and a panicking carnivorous plant. He stepped directly into the line of fire and started talking. "Hey, Chompy," he called out over the chaos, his voice cutting through the wailing and the shouted orders with the kind of calm authority usually reserved for hostage negotiators and kindergarten teachers. "It's okay, buddy. Look at me." The effect was immediate. Chompy's thrashing slowed, and several of its hunting appendages turned toward Jake's voice like satellite dishes homing in on a signal. The plant's bioluminescent patches flickered uncertainly between panic yellow and the familiar greeting green it had started displaying whenever Jake appeared. Team Leader Voss lowered her containment foam launcher and stared. "Morrison, what exactly do you think you're doing?" "My job," Jake replied simply, slowly approaching Chompy with his hands visible and empty. "Which, apparently, now includes interspecies conflict resolution." He turned to address the room at large, maintaining eye contact with Chompy while speaking to the assembled crowd of academics, security personnel, and what appeared to be at least 3 members of the university's board of directors, who had shown up for the entertainment. "So here's the thing," Jake began, his tone shifting into what his co-workers had started calling his fixing the universe voice. "Everyone keeps calling Chompy here a monster. But has anyone actually looked at what it's been doing for the past 2 weeks? Professor Vexlar cleared his throat nervously. "It has been consuming university property and creating an atmosphere of terror." "Wrong," Jake interrupted, pulling out his maintenance tablet and scrolling through his daily reports. "It consumed 3 pieces of equipment in the first 6 hours after arrival. Since then, 0 property damage during my shifts, 0 injuries, 0 incidents of any kind when it's properly fed and not being treated like a living weapon." He gestured toward Chompy, who had settled into a watchful but non-aggressive posture, still producing that low, uncertain humming sound. "This thing has been living in a sterilab environment for 2 weeks, being stared at by people who are afraid of it, with nothing to hunt and nothing to do except sit there and be studied. Of course it was acting out." Director Korthmak, a dignified Zentaurian whose authority was matched only by his ability to make funding disappear with a single disapproving look, stepped forward from the observation deck. "Mr. Morrison, while your rapport with the specimen is noteworthy, the safety concerns remain valid. This creature is classified as a Class 5 predatory organism." "So are Earth cats," Jake replied without missing a beat. "Doesn't stop people from keeping them as pets. The difference is knowing how to handle them properly." He turned back to Chompy and, to everyone's horror, reached out to gently pat one of the plant's lower leaves. Chompy responded by leaning slightly into the touch, producing a pleased rumble that vibrated through the floor. "Look, I get it," Jake continued, addressing the room while continuing to provide what appeared to be belly rubs to a creature that could theoretically digest him in minutes. "Nobody wants liability issues. But you're about to destroy something that's basically the galaxy's most effective pest control system because you're too scared to read the instruction manual." Dr. Kellyan, who had been unusually quiet during the proceedings, spoke up. "What instruction manual?" Jake grinned and pulled out his maintenance tablet again. "The one I've been writing for the past 2 weeks. See, while everyone else was running around screaming about how dangerous Chompy is, I was taking notes. Feeding schedule, behavioral patterns, environmental preferences, response to different stimuli. Turns out, when you treat something like a living creature instead of a doomsday device, it acts like a living creature." He swiped through his tablet, displaying graphs and charts that looked suspiciously professional for someone whose official job title was Maintenance Technician, Level 2. Flies consumed per day, steady at 43. Aggressive incidents when properly fed, 0. Number of actual pests eliminated from the xenobotany wing since Chompy's arrival, approximately 2,000, including those spider things from the vegan system that were laying eggs in the air ducts. Military exercise. A collective shudder ran through the assembled academics. Nobody liked the vegan spiders. "Property damage," Jake continued, really hitting his stride now, "has been exclusively limited to furniture and equipment that was already scheduled for replacement. Injuries to personnel, none, as long as you don't count hurt feelings and damaged egos." He looked directly at Director Korthmak. "You want to dispose of the most efficient, biological waste management system this university has ever seen, because it doesn't follow the handbook. But the handbook was written by people who never actually tried to understand what they were dealing with." Team Leader Voss lowered her weapon entirely. "Are you seriously suggesting we keep a Class 5 predator as a janitor?" "I'm suggesting," Jake said, giving Chompy another affectionate pat, "that maybe it's time someone around here started thinking outside the box, or in this case, outside the containment unit." The room fell silent except for Chompy's contented purring and the distant hum of the station's life support systems. Jake stood there, one hand resting on a creature that could kill him without breaking a sweat, looking for all the world like he was proposing the most reasonable thing imaginable. Which, knowing humans, he probably was. 6 months later, The Galactic University of Advanced Sciences had become something of a tourist destination, not for its groundbreaking research into quantum mechanics or its prestigious xenoarchaeology program, but because word had gotten out that they had somehow managed to domesticate a Class 5 predatory organism and turn it into the most effective pest control system in the known galaxy. Chompy now occupied a place of honor in the main xenobotany greenhouse, complete with a custom habitat that Jake had designed using a combination of university funding and creative interpretations of essential maintenance supplies. The plant had grown considerably, now stretching nearly 10 feet across, but its temperament had remained remarkably stable as long as the fly deliveries arrived on schedule. "And here we have our biological waste management specialist," Jake would tell the endless stream of visiting researchers, gesturing toward Chompy with the pride of someone showing off a prize-winning garden. "Averages about 60 pests eliminated per day, with a 97% efficiency rating and 0 workplace accidents." Chompy would perform on cue, demonstrating its hunting prowess by plucking flies out of the air with surgical precision, while producing that distinctive purring sound that had become the unofficial soundtrack of the xenobotany department. Professor Vexlar, who had initially been mortified by the transformation of his fearsome research specimen into what essentially amounted to a very large, very carnivorous pet, had eventually embraced his newfound academic celebrity status. His paper on interspecies behavioral modification through applied empathy had become the most downloaded research document in the university's history, and he was now fielding speaking engagements from institutions across 3 star systems. The key insight, he would explain to rapt audiences, carefully omitting the part where all his insights had come from watching a human janitor treat a murder plant like an oversized puppy, was recognizing that aggressive behavior often stems from unmet environmental needs rather than inherent malevolence. Which was academic speak for, the thing was just hungry and lonely, but we were too scared to notice. Jake, meanwhile, had been promoted to Xenobiological Maintenance Specialist, a title that came with a modest pay increase and the unofficial responsibility of training other staff members in what the university had started calling Morrison's Method. "The secret," Jake would explain to nervous new employees, "is remembering that every living thing basically wants the same stuff: food, safety, and maybe someone to talk to who doesn't immediately assume they're going to eat your face." His training sessions had become legendary throughout the university. Graduate students would sneak in to watch Jake demonstrate proper fly-colored techniques, which he'd elevated to an art form involving strategic positioning, timing, and what appeared to be an encyclopedic knowledge of insect flight patterns. "Now, your standard cafeteria fly is lazy and predictable," Jake would lecture, armed with his specialized catching net and the kind of authority that comes from being the only person willing to hand-feed apex predators. "They hang around the food dispensers because they're basically the insect's equivalent of college students. Easy targets for Chompy here, and they provide good nutritional value." Chompy would demonstrate by gracefully plucking a fly out of the air, then turning toward Jake with what could only be described as expectant pride. Jake would give the plant's main stalk an approving pat, and Chompy would purr like a 6-foot-wide carnivorous house cat. The real vindication came when other departments started requesting similar Morrison method solutions for their own problematic specimens. The quantum physics department wanted Jake to look at their mysteriously aggressive probability calculator. The xenoarchaeology wing asked if he could do something about their supposedly cursed artifacts that kept rearranging themselves. Even the cafeteria staff inquired about whether Jake's approach might work on their perpetually malfunctioning food synthesizers. "Turns out," Jake told Chompy during one of their daily sessions, "half the problems around here just needed someone to pay attention to what was actually going wrong instead of what the textbooks said should be going wrong." Chompy responded with a particularly satisfied purr and gently wrapped one of its smaller tendrils around Jake's wrist, in what had become their equivalent of a handshake. As Jake prepared to leave for the day, he paused at the lab door and looked back at Chompy, who was settling in for the night with the contentment of a creature that had found its place in the universe. Tomorrow would bring another day of fly catching, another batch of visiting researchers eager to see the impossible friendship between human and plant, and probably another memo from administration about some new crisis that needed the Morrison method. But for now, the most dangerous predator in the xenobotany department was purring peacefully in its custom habitat, having learned that sometimes the best way to survive in a hostile universe was to find someone willing to bring you flies and treat you like you mattered. Which, when you really thought about it, was a pretty good lesson for everyone involved.